those of you just joining us, welcome to the 11th Annual Summits River College Sacramento State Center for Practical and Professional Ethics Fall Ethics Symposium, The Ethics of Policing. We'll begin our third session of the day now with our speaker, Sanjay Marwah, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at California State University, East Bay, who'll be speaking on democratizing police accountability. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to thank, good afternoon, sorry. I'd like to thank Sacramento State Center for Practical and Professional Ethics, as well as Consumers River College, for inviting me, and I'm very honored. I've already had engaging dialogue in the first two sessions, and I hope I can engage you guys as well with this session. My focus is on police accountability. Obviously, we've talked about that even here today. This is a big issue, specifically looking at how to democratize the processes of police accountability, who should be involved, how should they be involved, and particularly the role of cognition. And obviously, as we all know, cognition means thinking. So, like the other speakers, I'd like to begin by just stating up front, my position is that I'm not pro-police or anti-police, but I think I am very strongly oriented towards helping to democratize police bureaucracies. That's really what I feel is a missing ingredient in policing today. And that's true also of other bureaucracies in other areas, not just police, but obviously the focus is on police bureaucracies. So I'm going to be talking a lot about police officers and their roles, and the importance of involving police officers in holding themselves accountable. So this concept of self-accountability is very critical from my perspective. There are questions, obviously, that are going to be raised, and I encourage you to in the question and answer session afterwards, including, so maybe I'm just trying to preempt, but the question is, is this realistic? And we believe it is, and hopefully this can start the dialogue. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author. Actually, we're working together and have worked, and I'll show you some of the work that we already have done in this area. We're working currently on a book proposal. Dr. Jerry Joplin at Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina. So he actually has really taught me a lot about the philosophical aspects of policing, and you'll see that evidenced here as well. I'm also using the work of a prominent sociologist. So we're going to use, a philosopher would be John Dewey, that you're going to be seeing, but also a prominent sociologist by the name of Robert Merton. And so let's get to it. Thank you very much. I'd like to start off with a quotation from Merton. Now, just to give you some background context, he's talking about the ethos of science. And one of the principles that you can see there is universalism. That is one of the critical elements of the ethos of science. And what he's saying is science as an institution can be democratic, and universalism is what you see. So can anybody tell me, and I don't want to make it too interactive, but possibly, what does he mean by universalism just based on what you read, especially the third sentence, second to really third sentence is really what are key. You can see that he means eliminating the restraints. Okay, the second sentence, on the exercise and development of socially valued capacities. So going back to what I said earlier, a few minutes ago, what I began is that police officers are not being allowed to develop their cognitive capacities. And going along with this, the focus of Merton's work, specifically, these are capacities that should be valued, especially if we want to have healthy and sustainable police accountability. Police accountability that involves people, that is police officers, not only the public, not only the leadership, but also police officers. And particularly helping them to figure out how they can improve, how they can do a better job and not impact, as we've heard, particular groups and individuals in our society, which they've historically, unfortunately, continued to do. So it requires a shift or shifts institutionally, organizationally, as well as, we would argue, in terms of police officers. So this could be implicated in terms of training as well. So the third sentence is very telling as well. Impersonal criteria of accomplishment, and not fixation of status characterize the open democratic society. I'm a little short, so I'm going to have to move it around. What's critical from my perspective is what I'm going to talk about is fixation of status. Status obviously means position, and various types of positions in terms of reputation, privileges that you get, not just in police, so that's a generic concept or a broader concept, but the key is not fixation of status. In the police context, this is what we're going to see. I'm sorry, it got cut off. I didn't realize it would. I'm going to try to move. The slide in a few minutes. But authority, police accountability, as well as even police decisions. Police have a lot of discretion, as we well know. Discretion means that they can make choices whether to, for example, escalate a situation, arrest, or make an arrest, or not to make an arrest. They have a lot of discretion. They make a lot of different decisions. And do they rely on their authority? I'm also going to talk about the subject of police accountability. I'm going to argue that police accountability and discretionary decisions that police make on a daily basis are decisions that they rely on authority significantly. And that's unhealthy, problematic, and it leads to, obviously, negative outcomes that we see all the time in the news. It leads to outcomes in terms of disproportionalities relating to race and ethnicity, class, gender, etc., in terms of police responses, as well as even holding the police accountable. So how do we, and I don't think it's going to show the last part, so I'm just going to have to read, how do we help develop police officers' capacities to evaluate, to decide what are the appropriate resolutions to what has happened? Now, of course, this is done legally, so there's some questions whether this can be, feasible, so to speak, but obviously they can be involved, and I like to think it's more of a learning experience as well, in terms of learning from each other, learning from the incidents that have happened, whether in their department or elsewhere, that they can actually learn in terms of how to pursue accountability that actually leads to positive changes in the way they practice policing. So you can see currently we have everything that police do gets filtered through the management levels, through the higher upper management. Obviously it filters down to the rest of the departments, and this includes accountability as well. So what we see also, though, there has been efforts to try to involve civilians in terms of holding the police accountable. For example, civilian review boards. I think all of you have probably heard of those, where civilians are going to be the ones to do what? Review and decide what are the appropriate resolutions to incidents involving police brutality, police corruption, and the like. But unfortunately, even those citizen or civilian involved efforts tend to be filtered through management, exclusively, predominantly, all the time, basically. So how do we promote evaluation, the cognitive capacities of police officers, what we call their agency? I think the beginning, one of the opening speakers made remarks on the symposium today. I think it was Dr. Swan. Police are human beings as well. And I think this really is consistent with what we're trying to argue here, that you got to develop their capacities. You can't just their thinking, their cognitive capacities, their ability to reason, to articulate why they made decisions, why they're trained to make decisions that way, what led them to that, what are the issues that police officers even face on a daily basis, including police stress, including a lot of pressures from their higher-ups, their bosses. These are real pressures. Just like we talk about gangs, there's a lot of pressures. There's peer pressures. Police officers have a lot of pressures. And similarly, I think we need to help enhance their agency, so to speak. Evaluation itself is a very heavily involved cognitive process with heavy cognitive content. What do we decide are the appropriate means to make decisions? And what are the appropriate ends? And I don't have time to go through all of this philosophical background on this, but I'll touch upon a few of this. Right now, unfortunately, accountability is dictated by authority, and evaluation is minimized. Evaluation means making appraisals, judgments, reasoning practically, as John Dewey puts it. But value judgments are involved. You're making judgments about what is the appropriate resolution. And police officers should be allowed to develop these capacities, to use them in what they do, because we would argue that that makes them more accountable to themselves, accountable to their peers, accountable to the public even. And so it's maybe a bottom-up kind of accountability rather than a top-down accountability, if you want. Police officers are also heavily controlled. What does that mean? Controlled by their bosses. There's a lot of rules that they have to follow, besides obviously the important legal considerations, due process that they have to use in terms of not violating people's rights. Now, we know they do violate people's rights, but they do have to follow certain procedures and rules. Unfortunately, being controlled, over-reliance on rules leads to minimization of agency. And agency, cognition, are being lost, are not being utilized in the ways that allow for police officers to grow and mature. One of the interesting tidbits, just to connect this, is that a lot of the officers who are involved in incidents of brutality, excessive use of force, tend to be younger officers, less mature officers. And so in some ways you can make the same connection in terms of saying that we need, I feel like I got to move around, sorry. We need to develop and allow officers to mature and develop. So let me go through what this means, and hopefully this will stimulate some dialogue. Looking at the standards of evaluation, because the criteria you use to evaluate police decisions as well as involved in police accountability, that is holding officers accountable, a lot of it are legal standards and organizational standards in terms of performance. Officers are told, we've heard a little bit about possibly quotas, that they have to do things a certain way, respond to incidents, they have to follow procedures and rules, as I mentioned. And so they're being evaluated, just like all of us are evaluated in the work we do, by our bosses, by our superiors, in terms of meeting certain standards. And that's fair. That makes sense. Unfortunately, that again removes the ability for officers to hold themselves accountable. And they're being evaluated based on authority exclusively, or is dominated by evaluation through authority. Another movement we've seen, as I mentioned, related to civilian review boards, is to have external evaluations of police. That is, from the outside of police, from the outside of police departments. And this has been a significant part of the movement to try to hold the police accountable by involving citizens, community members. And that makes sense. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, this gets filtered through management, upper management. And this also leads to or results in particular types of standards that are very formal, they do get to the principle of legitimacy, but they're very formal. And police officers themselves don't necessarily think that these standards make any sense, that they're making their jobs more difficult to do rather than helping them to do their jobs better. They view these as obstacles. And perhaps that's partly because it's being imposed from the outside, so they don't have any inputs or any say into why these rules exist in the first place or why we need to do that. And that's why they resist them or do not necessarily think they're of any value. This is why it's important to involve officers, to involve themselves in holding each other accountable, holding themselves accountable. Another movement more internally, a lot of what I'm talking about is internal to police departments, that is within police departments, is, have you guys ever heard of the concept of career criminals? These are criminals basically who are what? Commit crimes during their entire lifetime. They make it as part of a career, right? Similarly, this has been used and has become dominant in police accountability. It's been called by its leading proponent the new paradigm of police accountability. Samuel Walker talks about it using the same principle or concept of career criminal, that there's a small percentage of officers that are problem officers. They account disproportionately, just like career criminals, small number or percentage of criminals account disproportionately for a large percentage of crimes. In this case, small percentage of officers account for a large percentage of incidents of brutality, corruption, excessive use of force, and the like. Now that makes sense. However, that is still, unfortunately, very problematic in terms of the same things that I've been mentioning. It doesn't involve police officers themselves. They think and they perceive it just like many do in terms of offenders. We have laws and policies that are developed for career criminals, but are being applied to all kinds of offenders. 3 strikes laws, for example, are an example. They're really supposed to be and designed to address and target career criminals, but they get applied to all kinds of offenders. So everybody gets categorized. All type of offenders, they're just criminals. Regardless of what type of crime, they should receive the same kind of treatment, punishment. So applying it to the police context, if these small officers, again, are accounting for the problem officers, unfortunately, the disciplinary sanctions that exist internally in police, oftentimes they use the solution is to say, well, these are the rotten apples, the bad apples that we heard. So once we get rid of these rotten apples, these bad apples, we've gotten rid of the problem. And we apply it in the same way that we apply our policies, that there's zero tolerance, zero exceptions to any violations. What we're not doing is we're not addressing the institutional, organizational problems that exist, so to speak, as we're talking about in terms of reliance on authority, minimization of agency. So, another trend that has been mentioned is militarization. And I'd like to just talk about this in relation to what we're talking about now. Militarization means that police organizations have also become like military organizations in the way they're organized. And specifically comparing police officers, the rank and file, sworn officers, who are the largest in terms of number and percentage in police departments, but are at the lowest levels, okay, of the bureaucracy and hierarchy. In the military, and believe me, I'm not a military expert, so if I say the wrong or use the wrong term, please correct me, forgive me. Privates, as we know, are at the same levels as police officers, right? Now, just like the military, it makes sense to organize with a command and control hierarchical structure where there are many layers and it's all the decisions are made at the highest levels. But the military model, the paramilitary model, is not appropriate for police. As we well know, is that community policing tries to improve police-citizen relationships by increasing police-citizen relationships and contacts. Unfortunately, the paramilitary model, when applied to policing, doesn't allow that to happen. What we also do is, what we're talking about here is we reduce the agency, the inputs, the involvement, the participation of police officers. Their knowledge, their wisdom, their experiences are de-emphasized, are not used or utilized, and are not being part of what needs to be done because they're the ones who actually come into contact with citizens. Instead, what we see is that decisions are being made at the top, and the ones who are implementing it are the police officers, where they're having very little say. And this includes decisions about what to do when incidents of police brutality happen. We're not using the wisdom, the experiences of really the most experienced, that is the officers themselves. Cognition is critical, we believe, to democratizing police organizations, to helping police officers to make better decisions, as well as to make decisions to hold themselves accountable and their peers accountable. This is also obviously important, especially to address the policing culture or subculture, or cultures and subcultures that exist. And one of the things that people don't talk about much is police organizational cultures, the way they're organized, but that also plays a role as well. So going along with the lines of what we talk about in relation to this over-reliance on authority, the command and control structure, the over-reliance on authority also can be seen in terms of use of force, even though I don't have anything to show or a specific case study or case studies or examples of use of force. Let's just try to talk briefly about an example. Police officers are trained when they respond to a particular situation, a call for service, that once they come to the particular incident, there's always trying to take control of the situation. So the situation has to be controlled. And that's very critical because, especially for police officers who face risks in terms of being put and called to dangerous situations, that they want to make sure they can control a situation so it can't pose a threat to citizens as well as to themselves. And so in a lot of ways, it's all about maintaining order, exerting authority. Police officers are trained to exert authority. So it's no surprise when they come to any situation, they're going to use authority. And they're going to use their powers, including powers of deadly force, to try to control the situation. Obviously, it's supposed to be a last resort, deadly force, but unfortunately, it can quickly escalate because of the way they're trained, because of the dominance of authority. Everything comes from the higher-ups. Everything comes from what they should be told to do in particular situations. And I've been told in the academy, I haven't attended academy, police academy, and has anybody? You probably heard, probably in our classrooms as well, I'm sure you guys like instructors who actually tell a lot of stories. And stories in terms of war stories. What happened to me, how I, was in danger, and it's exciting. It's stories that they feel, oh, this is what it means to be a police officer. So when I teach at East Bay, students are like, have you been a police officer? And I hate that question. I dread that question because they're pretty much saying that, do you really know what you're talking about? So they're challenging my authority. But in all seriousness, that's very telling and a good example that, again, they like to talk about what policing is, why policing ultimately is doing the right things, using force. They're trained and they're experts to use force only when it's appropriate, but unfortunately, they come into situations where it's all about authority. So it's not surprising if you see incidents escalate. Police become aggressive, they don't take actions, they don't think about, they don't learn from incidents. They don't learn from situations, that they keep doing the same things in terms of training, in terms of storytelling, in terms of learning, and they do so using the same over-reliance on authority. There's also, as you can imagine, police are, as I mentioned, heavily involved in making sure they follow rules internally to police departments, but also follow the laws, due process, criminal procedures. And there has been a big movement in policing, and that's really been 20th century, from the mid-20th century, or probably the earliest was in 1930s where we saw this, but really began during the civil rights movement. We saw the due process revolution take place, so that has changed policing. They are taught to make sure everything is done by law. At least that's what they're taught. Now we know that doesn't always happen. They don't always follow the law, and they use the law to their advantage. In fact, they use a law in terms of strategically to get what they want to do. So for example, on a traffic stop, and I think you're going to hear this in the session tomorrow, do we as citizens have rights to tell police to allow them to search every time, or do the police have rights to search our cars, for example, if we're stopped on the side of the street? Can they stop? Can they search our cars? But do you think when we're stopped, when we feel like we have nothing to hide, or we're feeling uncomfortable, nervous, that a lot of people do actually let the police search their cars? So the police do use the laws to intimidate, to try to get what they want done in terms of doing their job. And so unfortunately, they do look at the laws that is outside the police departments as something that they can take advantage of. And again, consistent with authority. This is authority that they're looking at. They're emphasizing authority. Authority is what they're taught and trained to do. This is what's critical to their jobs, to making sure they're not endangered, hurt, that they rely on this authority. And so it's, in a lot of ways, it's indoctrination. It's been right from them when they're recruited, and we know that police also tend to come, a lot of police officers, and the recruitment tends to be also from people who have military backgrounds. So this is not surprising, consistent with the military, paramilitary model of organization, the focus on evaluation. So the law itself, just a few minutes on that. Prosecutors are reluctant to charge police. We've seen that over and over again. Why? Why are prosecutors reluctant to charge police? One of the reasons is they depend on the police. They need the police. They can't do the police work in terms of investigations, for example. They need the police, and they develop relationships, dependencies on each other. They're not willing to also challenge the turf of the police, and likewise the police are not supposed to challenge the turf of prosecutors. So there's a quid pro quo, so to speak, that's developed. And everything in terms of police accountability, unfortunately, we see everything, it comes through the legal processes, and legal systems are heavily involved. There are internal investigations, but the law has the final say. The law is more important than any police internal investigation. So to some extent, police departments know, for example, that they can get immunity if they work under the laws, with the laws, and the laws are supporting them. So that is another way they, so to speak, can exert their authority and make sure that they're not held liable. One of the things that I think you guys might know about as well is a type of policing. It's not necessarily just enforcement of laws. It's a type of policing that we've seen become more prominent, and it's called order maintenance policing. Other terms for it include broken windows or zero tolerance policing, popularized in New York with the NYPD, the New York Police Department. We've seen it being promoted and used all across the country, including here in California as well. And basically, order maintenance policing focuses on how, again, as I mentioned, using the same model, career criminal, problem officers, small percentage account, but applying that for all types of offenders or all types of officers who break the rules, who use force excessively, are corrupt, brutal, etc. That unfortunately with order maintenance, the focus becomes on aggressive policing. Again, exerting authority, the same kind of tendencies that we saw earlier in terms of authority becomes more important. Everything that's done formally by the rules, and even that includes what we should do with violators of these rules, including officers themselves. So officers are going to feel like these punishment systems, these sanction systems, and these don't always have to involve the law or the legal systems, even internally, are unfair, disproportional. They have led to the mass incarceration movement, among other things that we see in our society, in the society at large. But you can imagine officers don't very much like this kind of paradigm of police accountability, this maintain order, control, doing everything by the book kind of model. So these are some of the trends that we see. Accountability is all about authority. So now I'm going to move to how we need to elevate the evaluation part, the cognitive capacities part, by police officers themselves. And one of the things that we should try to think about or challenge ourselves is to start thinking about police officers just like we think of other legal professionals, like prosecutors, like lawyers. So what do legal professionals do? And why should we start thinking of police officers as legal professionals? What do legal professionals do? Prosecutors actually have more discretion than even police officers to offer plea bargains, to charge or not to charge, to pursue cases, to move cases forward or not. A lot of discretionary powers. Earlier in American history, judges had a lot of discretion, they still do, but prosecutors have a lot more discretion than even the police, and in a lot of ways than judges. Now, what does that mean? Legal professionals, prosecutors as a prototypical example of legal professionals. Legal professionals are not just professionals who are trained as experts to apply the law. They're trained and allowed to make decisions, just like, going away from the criminal justice system, medical professionals like doctors, prosecutors, legal professionals are allowed to make a lot of decisions about, again, about what is the ultimate goal, mission of their organization, how decisions that are usually reserved for police management, not reserved for police officers. So what we see is that legal professionals are ones who know the law, know what the law is supposed to do, what is the role of law, when should the law be used, how should it be used, what situations it's appropriate to use the law, what situation it's not appropriate to use the law. Just like doctors are trained when surgery is needed or when surgery isn't needed. But what are we seeing here is police officers who make up the majority of departments, the majority of the police workforce. They're not thought of as legal professionals. Police management doesn't trust police officers. We as a society probably don't trust police officers, although we need them, right? There's no question we can't do without them either. But what you see is we tend to think of them as technical professionals who know how to use weapons, and they are trained to use weapons, and that should be a significant part of their training because they can be put in dangerous situations, but not enough training. And we all talked about cultural sensitivity training as being critical, diversity training. We've seen that there's not a magic bullet. I'm not suggesting that just training, allowing police officers to become legal professionals means that they're going to get other types of training, not just exclusively weapons training, but nonetheless, they're the ones making decisions. They're the ones understanding what are the problems, what situations they come to, how to handle these situations, yet we don't trust them and we don't think of them as professionals. We think of them professionals, we encourage them to exert their authority, not to think, to apprise the situation, to figure out what to do, and going to police accountability, how we can learn from incidents, from mistakes, from tragic incidents that we've heard about today already. Tamir Rice, a boy, 12-year-old boy killed just for brandishing and playing with a toy gun. Now, obviously, there's no easy solution. I'm not saying this is going to resolve it, but nonetheless, we do really need to start thinking of police officers as legal professionals, and what I mean by we, is really police management should be encouraging police officers to start developing and using their cognitive capacities to being involved in the process of making decisions, as well as holding themselves accountable. We like to think of police officers as moral agents. So what does that mean, moral agents? Not that we're training them to figure out what's right or wrong only. Obviously, that's important. That's part of ethics training, and police do get ethics training. But moral agents in the Deweyian sense, that is John Dewey's perspective, is the type of problem-solving, decision-making that police officers will be moral agents when they start looking at and thinking of, if I take this action, what are the consequences? If we as a police department respond to these type of situations, what are the likely consequences? How do we avoid these consequences if they're problematic or can lead to problematic outcomes? This kind of training is involving police officers to actually solve problems and even define problems, for that matter. Learn how to define problems, frame problems, and solve problems by figuring out what are the appropriate means and what are our goals. De-escalation. Why is this not being promoted in policing? Because, again, going back to what I said, and going back to, we don't think of police officers as legal professionals. We don't think of them as ones who can use their thinking powers, their reasoning powers, to articulate what should be done. We don't encourage them to have dialogue among themselves. Everything is dictated and determined by authority. We're not teaching them to use their reasoning powers. In particular, John Dewey mentions practical reasoning, how to solve a situation. It could be an immediate situation, or it could be a situation that has been ongoing, a long-term situation, a situation that requires more coordination and efforts. It can't just be resolved quickly. But once we start encouraging this, we can also understand that police officers are exercising discretion, making discretionary choices, and holding themselves accountable, and they're understanding what resolutions, what is the appropriate resolution and solutions. They're making value judgments. They're involved right from the get-go. And unfortunately, maybe it's not realistic, we rely on authority. We rely on the laws, the formal legal processes, rather than relying on police officers. And hopefully that will help avoid what starts from when they're recruited, when they go to the academy, as well as while they're working, because then they can hold each other accountable as well. So what we envision is a multi-level accountability, decision-making, problem-solving capacities that involves police, agency, cognitive capacities. The standards that should be used should be the ones that are coming from multiple sources, not just relying on what our bosses tell us or what the law requires necessarily. We should encourage officers to start thinking about the consequences of their actions or potential consequences. How do we build the capacity of police officers as a democracy, but really more importantly, as a democratic organization? If we want to democratize our police departments, we can remove the layers, we can empower the police officers, but if we still rely on authority, if we still rely on rules, or over-rely on rules, what we're going to continue to see, well, thank you, what we're going to continue to see, so just repeating myself here, sorry. Unfortunately, what we continue to see is that incidents will not be prevented. They will continue to happen because of the same dynamics, the same pressures that we see over and over again, the same resolutions through the legal system on a case-by-case basis, not necessarily trying to address the organizational, institutional issues that really require addressing, but really enhancing the capacities of officers themselves. So just quickly looking at this table here, you see, I didn't talk too much about it, but I did hint at it. If you look at this table, especially the last column, what are the competencies that are valued in policing by police officers? We want them to be able to use weapons. And again, that makes sense. I'm not saying that's not important. But aren't we also neglecting other competencies? Obviously, competencies related to reasoning, cognitive capacities, which include actually morality, what's right and wrong, or what's the right resolution, how should we respond to a particular situation, or what's the wrong way to respond to a particular situation. And so what we also have, and I didn't use the language that Dewey uses, is we have fixed goals or ends, and we also have means that are standardized. This is what bureaucracies do. They standardize the means. You respond to the situation in the same way. That's very good because it makes you more efficient, because you get better at doing it because you practice it all the time. And you're trained and taught, and you do it enough that you get to do it. But the problem with using standardized means is not every situation is the same. One size does not fit all for police decisions as well as police accountability. And unfortunately, we look for those one size fits all solutions, including with technology. For example, we heard about body cameras possibly allowing for policing to be improved, helping to hold police accountable, but unfortunately they're not going to resolve the issues that we're talking about now that I brought up here in terms of standardized means, fixed ends, agency being removed. So what we envision is you have to look at the context, you have to enhance the agency of the officers, you have to democratize police accountability, police departments and organizations as well. And this is not going to be any easy task by any means, but we believe ultimately healthy accountability, sustainable accountability, healthy accountability from our perspective involves not being determined in advance, trying to minimize status, authority. Sustainable, it has to involve the cognitive capacities, reasoning powers, and capacities of officers themselves. Otherwise, any system that you have is going to change, and it's going to rely on the same paramilitary, managerial-dominated focus on command and control and authority being the number one goal of what police do and what they want to do, as well as how they police themselves. So we end up with a society where police are not going to be democratic because they're not able to use, or officers, the police themselves, the officers who are out on the streets are not able to use their cognitive capacities. They're not allowed to, they're not encouraged to do so, and it becomes an elitist system. So going back to this, universalism in science means not relying on personalistic, particularistic criteria. We don't want biased science. We want to be objective. We don't want biased policing, but that means that we don't want police also, obviously, we want them to be able to think, to be able to develop their capacities, the capacities that can help police do their jobs, and more importantly, in this day and age, to hold themselves accountable. Thank you.
Offering formal comments on Professor Marwah's paper will be Claudio Vera Sanchez, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at Roosevelt University, and Jacob Velasquez, doctoral student in philosophy at University of California, Davis, and if I may say with great pride, former CRC philosophy transfer student.
All right, so Dr. Marwah, thank you so much for that presentation. It really gave us a lot to think about in terms of police accountability. I had some comments slash questions that hopefully you might be able to answer for us. So when I conducted ride-alongs with police officers in the city of Chicago, one of the questions that I asked them is, have you ever had any complaints? And I was really trying to not necessarily assess accountability, but trying to understand how does it work. And I was riding along, of course, with special units, and one of the officers said, well, I have 100 complaints. Another one said 130 complaints. Another one said 150. And I was quite shaken by that because I thought, well, if a college professor had 150 complaints, they probably wouldn't be working at the university any longer, right? And so I started to think about how is it that a police officer can possibly have so many complaints and by the same token continue to keep their job? Well, when I came to understand who actually took the complaints, it was other police officers. So this is tantamount to one of my college buddy professors taking the complaints of students and saying, well, here, I'll take them, guys, but I'll put them in the back of my desk or whatnot. So my question is really, how do you make police accountable in a system where police are actually policing themselves? Question number one. And then secondly, in terms of accountability, we know that a lot of police departments legally can't require quotas in terms of arrest, but in practice, they do use variations of the language to sort of say, well, we don't use quotas, but nevertheless, this is a performance measure. When I went last week to Louisiana, one of the prosecutors, he was the director of the prosecutors in Louisiana, he spoke to us and he said, you know, in order for a prosecutor to be promoted here, we don't only look at whether or not they have a certain number of convictions, we also look at whether or not that prosecutor actually has effective community engagement. And I was really surprised by that, because that means that that prosecutor is not only required to have a certain number of convictions, but is required to engage with the same communities that he or she is policing and whose lives are being affected by that. So my question was, can you think of any innovative strategies of accountability that can help us in terms of reform?
Thank you. Those are very good questions. As I mentioned in the presentation, it's very difficult in terms of how realistic we can implement this kind of approach or reorient this kind of approach and put into practice. But I think your comment that prompted your question is right on, in terms of there are already criteria that are being used, but again, they're consistent with, this is kind of like a badge of honor. If I have more complaints, I'm actually a good officer because I'm doing what needs to be done, is a kind of internal kind of evaluations that take place. Now, unfortunately, that's not going to allow police officers to really hold themselves accountable, for sure. So I'm not really sure I have a solution by any means. For your second question, maybe I could get some clarity, but you had said that
in terms of more innovative strategies of accountability, yes, and having officers perhaps engage with the community as part of the criteria of accountability, as opposed to just having arrests, might make situations perhaps better.
Yeah, and that's what I was alluding to, and I thank you for clarifying. What I was alluding to was that this would help empower, and this is what community policing attempts to do, among other things, is to help use and consult with the community and citizens and community members. But unfortunately, everything is filtered through the management levels. Everything is formalized and legalized, that officers really don't get to practice it. Leadership is not committed to it. The only policing innovation that I believe that shows promise is actually an interesting policing innovation, because it's not the normal deterrence-based that we saw that dominates even with police accountability. That is pulling levers is focused deterrence. The reason that it's different than deterrence, and it's different than most policing strategies and tactics, is because it has a rehabilitation component. And that's what makes accountability even more involved with, in terms of police officers holding themselves accountable. Self-accountability or peer accountability is if there's opportunities to learn, to grow, to not be excessively punished, not because, again, you've got these complaints, it's come out to public, the management has no choice, the chief has no choice, or he or she has no choice, but to punish you and make you, basically be removed from the organization, from the department. And that's the solutions or the responses that have predominated. But the other way is to try to help police officers, the ones who do have complaints, to try to engender this kind of culture that you will be rewarded if you do other things. Policing is not just about, again, number of arrests or responses in terms of responding in particular ways. So, there's a glimmer of hope, but unfortunately it might be unrealistic with the way police are organized, rather.
All right. So I'd like first to say thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting, and I think that you've identified a problem, the broken system of accountability, which is something that perhaps has been missed for a while, and have identified a potential solution, which is really interesting. I have two questions about the solution. The first derives from the observation that when we, well, first of all, I should say the solution I have in mind in particular is that we make police accountable to their peers. I worry that we have this observation that when we evaluate our friends, when we evaluate our peers who we think to be in similar situations as us, we might tend to be overly nice. And so I wonder whether this potential solution faces a problem, namely that we might find that when police are holding each other accountable, that they're too easy on one another. They let each other off the hook. That's the first question. The second question is similar in that I think there might be another problem facing this kind of solution. As we know, the police is a hierarchical institution, as you mentioned, and we might think that there's some undermining of that hierarchy if we allow, say, the private level of police officer, the police officers that are on the streets engaging in these activities to evaluate members of the police community, the policing community that are at higher levels. You might think that in doing so, we undermine the authority that exists among the different levels, the different ranks, and that might cause a problem. So you might ask, is it the case that implementing this kind of solution might require a restructuring of the institution, restructuring it in particular into a non-hierarchical institution?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good questions. I think you correctly pointed out in your first question, comment, that obviously to expect police to hold themselves accountable is unrealistic in terms of full accountability, if you want. On the other hand, I think depending on the context, in terms of the organizational context that police officers work, it can be encouraged. Now that obviously is not necessarily going to happen in most police departments because of the way they're organized currently, the way they think they should be organized, the importance of authority, so it relates to your second question comment as well. So authority is not going anywhere anytime soon, I don't think. It's not going to happen easily. On the other hand, police officers should and can be allowed to hold each other accountable. We've seen many cases in policing involving even internal affairs, which we know and we don't think of very highly as doing what Jacob has mentioned in terms of holding each other accountable. They're not good at policing themselves. But this is true about any profession. I mean, I don't want to use, it's unrelated, but the analogy you could make even with professional sports. Nobody wants others to hold them accountable. They want to hold each other accountable. And police are no exception. The way we want to do that is we want to encourage them in terms of looking at articulating, deliberating, making judgments and values about, and this is what we're trying to engender or to talk about the importance of, is did you do it? Is this the right way to respond? Is this the right resolution? What are the means? What are the consequences? That kind of thinking hopefully can go some way in terms of helping them to hold themselves accountable. Now, it probably is, again, unrealistic in today's policing environment, but I think it's a needed solution. Then quickly, the second one, well, I kind of answered the second one too, but the authority is not going away anytime soon, and there are problems in undermining authority. Obviously, that could lead to problems, many problems for police in terms of how they're organized, and they don't have unlimited resources, and so it makes sense to organize hierarchically. There's no question about that. It does lead to efficiency. The problem, though, is that there's a tendency to have excessive controls, over-reliance on rules, and these rules end up taking over. People start gaming the system, so to speak, in terms of looking at how they can manipulate the rules and use the rules to their advantage. And we're kind of actually setting up incentives for police to be corrupt, to use excessive force, and really don't have any punishments because we're letting them, basically do this. So I have no easy answer for that one either, unfortunately. Thank you.
The floor is now open for questions.
I noticed that in the way that you've outlined the police officers' kind of authority hierarchy, they're trained by police officers, they're managed by police officers, the upper bureaucracy is police officers, and then they themselves actually don't have input on their own situation, so they're in this weird middle zone where they're kind of alienated from their own job. Do you think that it would be a viable solution if perhaps we decentralized different aspects of their structure such that maybe civilians were involved also in their training, also in their authority structure, even if they did not exert any authority themselves? And any thoughts on that?
No, I think there is one example, and I didn't talk about it with the previous questions of the panelists here. I didn't talk about it, and I think it is appropriate even for their questions, and your question as well, thank you. There's an example of work that's actually done in Oakland, California, as well as in Seattle, and this was done much earlier in the 60s. And the concept or the type of policing that was used was team policing. And this involved police officers themselves, just like I'm talking about in terms of agency, and in terms of what to do with problem officers, excessive complaints. And that has shown some success. Now, whether you can scale it up is a different question. There's always scaling problems. Just because it works here doesn't mean it always works everywhere else, and how to make it work, implementation. But that seems to have, is consistent with what you mentioned in terms of trying to at least reduce over-reliance on authority to some extent, to involve officers in what to do with other of their peers in terms of violations, committing illegal criminal acts or violations of department policies even. And so that seems to have a lot of promise. Now, again, I don't think it's been practiced enough to really say if it can work for all departments, and whether it can work now in today's society, today's environments is a different question. We didn't have the war on drugs. We didn't have the war on terror like we've seen. So I don't know if it's even going to be possible. There's another movement in policing called intelligence-led policing, which is being pushed from the federal level, which again, unfortunately, is very authority-driven. So there's trends going the opposite way. But I think you're right. There are examples, but they're very few and far between, unfortunately.
Thank you guys all for coming today. I appreciate everything. So due to the different ways officers are held accountable in each department that they work for, do you guys think that the people who actually call them, they're afraid to call them, especially with everything going on nowadays, that they're maybe I should just handle the situation myself, and it could lead to rise of crime just due to the fact that they don't want to call an officer and then have it turn into something else?
Yeah, there's been some, including unfortunately the FBI director who's brought this up, that because of the increased scrutiny that police have been under, being on the news all the time, that this is going to lead police not to do their jobs, to fight crime. And it's really hard to say, although there is some evidence, it's very, very limited. There's very little on this, even looking at body cameras, for example, and how that's going to help with police accountability. That they do change the way they police. There's some evidence, but it's very little. It's very hard to come to any definitive conclusions. So I think the jury's out, so to speak, on this. I don't think they're going to change necessarily. I think police officers, just like everybody else, they adapt. And they're going to adapt, and they have adopted to, figuring out ways where they can still do their jobs and do also meet other concerns. So I don't think it's going to change the way police do things anytime soon. That's my assessment.
So that's an excellent question, actually. Some of the data that I've come across, especially in Arizona, where they passed law SB 1070, which really forces, police officers to criminalize immigrants, you have a lot of instances of domestic violence that are going unreported. And partly because now not only are the women afraid that the men that they're with are going to get deported as well, but also it creates a lot of negative situations with that. So I think that public policy helps to create this divide between the police and the people that they're serving. In Chicago, I also found, when I did ride-alongs with police officers, that people were incredibly distrustful of police officers. And I was talking about this during lunch. At one point, we went with the special units to a park. There was a shooting at a kids' party, and I was explaining this to my colleagues earlier, and it was really horrific, right? I mean, you see, nothing happened to the kids, by the way. But again, yellow tape around the kids' party hats and whatnot, hundreds of people in the street, and the police officers walk around and are trying to get information. We want to catch this guy and whatnot. And the officers come back to the car and they say, we asked over, 10, 20 people. No one says that they saw anything. You really think no one saw anything? But again, they become so distrustful of police that they don't want to help. And so the officers at that point were effing animals. That's how they express themselves about the people in the community. But they don't understand that it's a long legacy of distrust that has been built over time, where people no longer feel safe coming to the police in terms of dealing with criminality and these types of problems. Excellent question.
I have a bit of anecdotal data. In my own experience, I've been, it was actually just over a year ago, had banging on my door at about 2 o'clock in the morning. My kids were upstairs asleep, and I saw lights shining through my windows, and I thought, well, who's banging on my door? And so I got up and I went downstairs, and I saw someone peeking through the windows. Still didn't know who it was. No one identified themselves. I then, after the continued banging and me thinking to myself that I should probably attempt to address this person or these people, decided to ask who it was. And it was only at that point that the person banging on the door addressed himself as a police officer. And so I looked through the peephole just to ensure that it was a police officer before thinking about answering the door, thinking about opening the door. And I didn't see anyone. Now, so I had two thoughts. The first thought was that maybe it's not a police officer at all. But my second thought was maybe it is a police officer. But then I was still worried. I know what I look like. I know how I might feel aggravated at that moment that these people are knocking on my door, banging on my door, in fact, when my children are upstairs trying to sleep, and for no apparent reason. And this is, I think, an example which can demonstrate that there are real fears out there by real people, which might lead them to distrust the police in this way or in other ways. And so I think it's a really important question to ask, and I think it's an even more important question to figure out how to address the problem that there does seem to be. I did open the I did open the door eventually, and they treated me with kindness and respect. So.
We have time for just one more quick question.
So I agree with like a lot of what you were saying, and I thought about how you were saying like police management doesn't really, I guess, respect police officers as much, and so I was thinking, well, isn't that possible then to send like a subliminal message out to the civilians and citizens to have that same lack of respect, and then like, I mean, I don't know, I'm thinking particularly about like their income, like how they're like a lot of them are severely underpaid, you know, so it's sort of like, well, that says something, you know, especially in our society where we celebrate a lot of rich, you know, people that make a lot of money, and so that's what we, you know, aspire to be. So I'm thinking, do you think like that has something that plays a role in it as well?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, comment. I think that unfortunately police officers also trained in terms of the emphasis on authority, obeying commands, following the rules. Internally, even when they're recruited in the academy and while they're working in the field, so to speak, they're really taught policing as something where you don't really trust citizens. That you shouldn't trust citizens because your job is to take control of the situation. You're trained to take control of the situation. You're not taught necessarily to look at ways to try to figure out. So, I mean, they're talking about in the Bay Area, and I was listening to a radio story about this, that, you know, they're trying de-escalation tactics, so to speak, just like we could have seen that Officer Wilson could have done with Michael Brown. From the moment that Michael Brown was running away from from Officer Wilson, he could have stopped right there and didn't have to shoot. But they say, oh, adrenaline took over, and at that point he couldn't shoot because, you know, Wilson alleged that, you know, Michael Brown was trying to grab his gun while he was seated in his patrol car, and the shot went off, right? And so he was trying to get my weapon, and so that's why. But again, Michael Brown was running away at that point. He could have stopped and called for backup and not have necessarily shot Michael Brown in the back while he was running away. So why isn't that? And so again, I think part of it is in terms of us versus them. I think there is a lot of denial by policymakers, by police management, by society, and to some extent as well. I mean, not everyone, but there is a denial in terms of, you know, there is a police subculture. There is really organizational cultures, if you want, that don't necessarily teach police officers and the police to trust citizens, that we can trust them. So I think you're right. I mean, absolutely. That trust is something that Americans don't trust government in any way, and, you know, regardless, and they don't. That's true about the police to some extent, even though, you know, they do have more confidence and legitimacy than other institutions. Nonetheless, I think police are taught not to trust either.
We are unfortunately out of time for the current session. Fortunately, it's not the end of the symposium. Please join me in thanking our speaker and our panelists, and please thank you for being here.